opportunity, wealth. In the middle of the 19th century, it was as exotic a frontier as outer space is today. The cry of gold in California triggered an extraordinary stampede of fortune seekers from all corners of the world. When California became a state in 1850, America dreamed of uniting the remote West with the East. But there was one hitch. The journey across the continent was like a slow waltz to the moon. Travelers had to endure one of three miserable, life-threatening choices. Riding on horseback for a month through the malaria-infested jungles of the Panama Isthmus. A 4-month sea voyage around Cape Horn, or several harrowing months crossing was first imported a year later to America and put to use in the Pennsylvania coalfields. By the 1850s, the railroad annihilated distances at 25 miles per hour throughout the East and all the way to the Mississippi River. Roughly 10,000 miles of track linked cities on the east side of the river by 1853. But it was a terrifying iron monster, dirty, dangerous, and often fatal. The technology of steam made explosions, breakdowns, and fires a terrifying reality. Despite the flaws, some people envisioned the railroad as the key to westward expansionism. But a railroad all the way to the Pacific seemed to be an impossibility. 1,600 grueling miles of vast, empty space separated Kansas City, the railroad's westernmost stop, from the Pacific. In between were two massive mountain barriers, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra. The companies would be awarded 20 square miles of land. It was a fortune in real estate. And since no meeting point was determined for the two competing railroads, the owners of the Central Pacific in the west and the Union Pacific in the east got set for a race to see who could fling the most track across the country. In Sacramento, this urgency suited the Big Four's entrepreneurial appetite. But even before the work started, the Big Four and Judah came to loggerheads as to how their railroad would be built. They wanted to build it as quickly come from the forests of Minnesota and travel hundreds of miles down rivers and by wagon. Once they orchestrated the supply line, the track layers quickly advanced across the Nebraska plains, laying about a mile of track a day. One reporter on the scene in 1866 described the intense activity.
4 men seize a rail, less than 30 seconds to a rail, and so 4 rails go down to the minute. It is a grand anvil
The more convinced
chorus.
I am that they all have to be killed. General Sherman, 1872.
One way the railroads and the military attacked the Native Americans was to slaughter the buffalo, which they depended on for their existence. Over 12 million buffalo roamed the West when work began on the railroad. Sometimes a single herd would blanket the vast landscape as far as the eye could see. The railroad companies hired sharpshooters to kill countless thousands of buffalo on the Great Plains to make way for the train. One Indian chief pleaded for the killing to stop. By Ascanio Sobrero in Italy. The compound was so volatile that the Central Pacific hired a chemist to mix a fresh batch every morning in a special kitchen near the worksite. With nitroglycerin, the work now moved twice as quickly but was far more lethal than black powder. Crocker eventually stopped using it. On August 29, 1867, 1 year after work began, the Summit Tunnel was finished ahead of schedule. 3 months later, supply trains were running through it towards Nevada. The 1,600-foot tunnel was the longest in the world at that time. A modern marvel in engineering and human endurance. Meanwhile, the men of the Union Pacific, in 6 years, they had only spiked 119 miles of track. But it was the most difficult line ever built in the world. The Union Pacific had completed 540 miles across far more gentle territory, But they now face their most formidable challenge, the kinds of mountainous terrain that the Central Pacific had faced, the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming and the Wasatch Range in Utah. But nature was good to them. To cross the Rockies, the Union Pacific only had to bore 4 tunnels. But ahead lay a battle with the wilderness that was to be every bit as torturous as the Central Pacific struggle with